Okay, so welcome everybody on this super rainy Wednesday evening in Berlin. My name is Corina. I'm one of the co-organizers of Women Take Makers Berlin. We are a community that has been encouraging diversity in tech since 2015. We strive for visibility, networking, and resources to make the tech world in Berlin more inclusive. We're one of the most active chapters of the global Women Take Makers program, run by Google, and one of the most active tech communities in the city. Our meetup groups are always open to people of all backgrounds, so it's regardless of gender, age, race, expertise, everybody's welcome. I know we're called Women Take Makers Berlin, but we always want to emphasize this. All our events are free of charge. We do ask that you kindly respect our shared code of conduct. In essence, is really treat each other with respect and be, empathetic humans. This event is being recorded, as I mentioned, and we're gonna have a super cool talk by Sven on creating test automation frameworks. Sven is a passionate tester and software crafter. They provide coaching for their teams, are enthusiastic of clean code, spent a lot of time in QA and testing as well in the development space. Sorry. During this time, they needed to overcome many problems related to maintainability and stability of test automation frameworks. They're language and technology agnostic, try to find the right solution for the given problem they're facing at the time. Besides passion for technology, Sven is a nature lover and traveler who loves to explore new places and communities. I'm going to pass the baton to him so he can tell you also maybe a bit more about himself and kick off this talk. One more thing before this. So you will have 15 minutes to ask questions at the end of the talk. I muted everybody during this time. After the talk is over, I will allow all of you to unmute so you can ask questions. If you're not comfortable to do so, you can do it in the chat. Okay, take it away, Sven.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen? I see some nods. Perfect. Thank you very much for having me here. And yeah, thank you for the introduction, Corinna. As Corinna said, like I am having problems with my. I'm a software tester and engineer. I'm working right now for the BKK VBU. And I created for a couple of companies different testing frameworks, either from scratch or repaired them. And I really like doing this. I'm also tweeting from time to time under my nick of Crafting Tester, but for some reasons I got lazy the last couple of years. So what I wanted to talk about with you is about testing frameworks and how to set them up and why do we need them anyways. So let's have a look at this. I think a lot of people have seen this already, like the testing pyramid, where they say like, oh yeah, we have unit tests, we have component tests, we have acceptance, and so on. And when we think about testing, often, or testing and testing frameworks, we often talk about the topmost layer, like the GUI tests, and sometimes also the acceptance test layer. But in this talk, I really want to focus on the GUI tests, on like either web tests, mobile application tests, and I will talk strong. So I will have some examples from the Android world, but a lot of things can be used in different contexts as well. So why do we automate anyway? So why do we need it? I mean, you can see like there's still a layer of manual tests there, but why do we need to automate? I think it can save a lot of time. Like think of your software as this kind of Jenga box. So you're stacking stuff and stuff and stuff, and after sometimes you realize, whoops, sometimes it gets brittle. I don't know where and how I can. So if you want to test everything manually, it takes a lot of time to do this. So automation is a very integral part of removing the time you need to build something. You have growing code bases, as I said before, like it's growing and you need to repair it. you have a better risk mitigation because you can test more things in a shorter time. And honestly, testing can be tedious. If there are any testers here and had like this Excel sheets of thousands of test cases, this is tedious. This doesn't make any fun. So automation is a good way of this. So a lot of people start, or a lot of companies actually think about record and play. So they record something and they replay it. And there are nowadays really good frameworks for this. But a lot of times when you build this, it can happen that it's getting also very, like the code gets really hard to read. It's really hard to maintain sometimes. And what happens to me usually when I had this problem, it looked like this after a while. And you have like this kind of spaghetti code or this kind of, you try to record it and it's everything is a mess. So it's not always like this. Don't get me wrong. And I say like this is the only solution, but this is what I've experienced a lot of time. So then people start to do it themselves. So they think like, okay, there are a lot of tutorials. Let's try it by ourselves. So they start reading tutorials, they're asking coworkers, and they do a lot of trial and error. And a lot of tutorials out there are mostly for very, very simple cases. So it's kind of a maze. You have to progress to find new tutorials, and they are not helping. And so it happens often that you create a framework or create some tests, but they are like yeah, they're not really looking good. So this is what one of the things I've seen often. Like you have like a very, yeah, you have some tests and they do some things, and on the first view it's really hard to see what they do. And as I said, like this is an espresso example. Espresso is not helping a lot, so this is really kind of unreadable. Like if you have some, you have to really understand and read what's going on. um, and you have this, time flows by, you have some time constraints, the stability goes down, and people are like, why are the tests are red again, and why is it happening? And it often happens that people then have to basically look into the test, come back from go into a break, come back and build us red again. Oh my gosh. So they have to fix it, and they have to navigate through this really unreadable, unmaintainable code. And this gives testing and test automation sometimes a very bad reputation of being, oh, it's anyways flaky. Why do why should we care? So this is things again I've encountered often, and I've seen a couple of times. So what happens is you start repairing on the fly. Again, the red builds, it builds up frustration in you, in your team. And actually, it's hard to sell at the time to market sometimes if you build an automation tool and things, uh, tests are red. So you either have to think like, um, do we ignore the tests or do we fix them? Or someone has to go there, test it manually because it's not working. And this is kind of a very frustrating thing to happen. And it happened to me. It happens to me more than I would like, to be honest. But I think everyone who has seen this or has seen this kind of work knows it. So, whoops, wrong side. So how can we do it better? So let's analyze what we got and what we can do better. So what I often do, like if it's more complicated, I'm starting to building a framework around it. So I'm starting getting some things and building them into reusable components, reusable parts. And why a framework? So we can actually have a separation of concerns. So in this test you've seen before, like you have everything mixed. You have like the data creation or the data you want to test mixed with all the flows, mixed with all the driver interactions. So everything is basically mixed into one big file. And you have to um, reuse, like if you want to write the test 5 times, you have to copy paste things 5 times, which is not fun at all. And one thing which is really helpful if you have a really complicated domain language or wanted to integrate it into domain-driven design, for instance, using your domain language can be so helpful because if there's a test failing for a certain domain or for a certain item, you can actually search for this one in your code base and find like, oh, yeah, this is the test belonging to this one. Great. Yeah, so let's have a look at the test I was showing you before. So what are the things we can think of which are reusable or which are bad, or things which actually pop into our eyes? So there's one thing, there are matchers, in the meaning of we try to find something on the page. Um, there are interactions like a click or like a scroll or what, or getting things from the item. And there are kind of our assertions. So those are the things we have in our tests, which maybe can be done differently. So what I did in this example, I basically put it into a user flow and made basically readable tests. So even if you'd never read the code before it, you actually know what the test is doing, because it's like in a human readable language. And one thing I often do for coding, or which is important for me when I do code, is nowadays we don't code for machines anymore. We code for other people. We have always people collaborating with us, and the more complex your code is, and if it's really hard to understand, it's really hard to get other people to do your work in a way, or like to do things you want to do. And so if you're building a framework, you can always think in kind of layers. So you have the text or tests, you have your framework, which is interacting with the driver, which is in the end interacting with the application. And if we look a little bit deeper into the framework, I'm often doing kind of like a data part, which is basically taking care of data generation, data access. You can have like a more the workflow page object part, which is interacting with the driver and by proxy with your application. You can have reporting in there. You can have like literally everything you can think of can be in this framework. And this can help you write a little bit more concise tests, more readable tests. And let's look at a little bit more into the tests. Like they are kind of orchestrating your tests. They don't have states. They get the state, like they get some information from the data layer and orchestrate and telling like the page object workflow layer what to do. Keep it really simple. Make them easy to read, because if again, as I said before, if they are hard to read, you don't know what they do on the first line, and then people are like, yeah, maybe let's just remove them. They don't do. Repositories, as example, they hold the state. They trigger trigger fetching the data. They use, for example, data creation objects, or they use data transfer objects to talk to the API. So they are basically your data source. And this is, for example, a very stupid example again. Like, don't take the code for really serious. It's basically just a very simple example of getting this article in this case. And yeah, this would be one example. The advantages is you have a centralized data handling. So always, if you have changes in your test data, you have a single point of change to do this. And separation of concerns, as I said before, you have this one place where you can do it. You have a really increased readability. And if you want to do it, you can actually randomize or pseudo-randomize your test data if you want to have some broader impact, or if you want to do some penetration tests, for instance, or some performance tests, you can do this. And this makes things easier. Then the workflows, it's one thing I always use. It's not like, it's one thing which makes your tests more readable. The workflows are basically like, go there, open this, read this, and these flows can be reused. For instance, like for a login screen, you don't want to write like 5 times. Yeah, enter this there and enter this there, and then click on login, and you're done. And they are basically like the middleman between the page object and the test itself. So this is a little bit of Kotlin magic in there, but what happens is basically you say like the main page has the functionality to navigate to the product list and so on. So it makes basically things easy to read, and you don't have to think about any kind of any kind of pages and page objects in your flows. The advantage, I said, like you do couple the user flows, it gets cleaner. It's easier for onboarding people because again, you have your domain language and people can use this instead of thinking like, okay, now I have to use this page and this. So it can really help for new people to get on speed easier. The page objects, I think this is this is the candidate where a lot of people heard about already. It's one of the things which is, this is, I think, in test automation, it's the most known pattern out there, and for a good reason, because again, like you have a lot of selectors, locators on your pages, and they change often, or they can change often, and you really want to be able to change this at one place. So, and this is why you put most of your locators, and especially in Android case, also the way how you find it, into those page objects. And this is for instance, like what you've seen before, which was before on the test. It's now in one file. It's still kind of unreadable. Again, Android and Espresso, but it's basically, you know what it's doing because the function name is at least readable. So again, like the advantage is you have like the driver specific implementation in there, you have a single point of change, and you can hide the complexity of the DOM of your page or your application because it's something maybe you don't want to propagate to everyone in the team. And yeah, so in the end, what did we learn of this and why do we do this? Like, as I said, like readability and maintainability is super important for your team and for everyone. And if you have tests which are basically failing and you can't repair them easily, or it's really complicated to read them then the value of your tests and your testing goes down significantly. And I've seen this, unfortunately, also in my case. Like I worked with companies where this was a problem. And especially when I think of my time when I was starting, I was writing those kind of tests you've seen very, very early. And I got a lot of blame for, and at this point I was like, yeah, whatever. Nowadays, I really understand why it's so important, because you want to be able to do your repairs quickly. You want to release quickly. Like if you think nowadays we have like really short release circles, like some companies doing continuous deployment, and then everything needs to be done in a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds, maybe even. And if then your tests are always failing and it's really complicated to repair them, it's, how to say, like it can be frustrating for you and your team. And yeah, this is basically what I wanted to tell you. And yeah, thank you very much for joining. I think now it's time for a lot of questions. I hope so. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven. Give me a second to allow everybody to unmute themselves. Okay, so you can do so. If you have a question, please go ahead.
I have one. What your suggested solution or like approach would be if you're testing, say, like, or building a framework for big scale systems? So we're talking web, we're talking native mobile applications, we have like common business flow and user interactions through mobile and through web. So what tools would you use and what common approach would you use for this kind of situation?
So I think one of the things I was talking before was, let me just go back to this slide, which is basically like the test automation pyramid. I mean, it's not a law to use it this way, but if you have like big scale systems, you really want to have your tests in the lower layers. So you want to test early. You want to have your developers write a lot of unit tests. You want to have a lot of acceptance tests on your API layer, because usually if you have mobile applications, they have an API and they can interact with this. And for instance, if you have a Java tool, you can use rest assured, same for Kotlin. And this
Yes.
could be, sorry.
Sorry, I'm truly sorry to interrupt, but yeah, say we have REST API, developers wrote the unit tests, we're talking purely GUI tests.
And yes, pure GUI tests for what I usually say is what I usually do is use the native version. So for Android, I'm often using Espresso. For iOS, I'm often using XUI tests. It creates actually a duplication of tests, but usually like the implementations of the both are kind of similar, but kind of different. So these are a good idea. You can use Espresso if you would like to, and you can actually, what I did at OLX, for instance, was I built kind of the page objects, which implement a different driver depending on if I do test mobile or if I do test web. You can basically inject a different driver. So you can build basically a driver object which has all the functionality, like the implementation of a driver. For instance, for Espresso, you have like this kind of ugly code, which is having this on view, yada, yada. You can put this into a driver class, which just takes the things you want to click on or you want to find. And you can do the same for XUI tests and the same for your web application. And what you can do is, like, if you test on web and all the flows are very similar, you can use those user flows, inject into your page objects the driver object, and you can use the same code base basically for everything. But it always depends on how similar are your systems, how complex is it actually to test, how complex is it to create data. And one of the most important things I would say is actually think of what you want to test, because I've seen a lot of times that companies or teams are testing far too much. And there's a really good talk from actually Richard Bradshaw and also another one from Mark Winteringham. They are like one from Mark Winteringham is like, it's about Tata and Tutu, which is basically saying like testing through the UI or testing the UI. So what it basically says is like, you have to think, is the test what I'm doing right now? Do I test something which is UI specific, or do I test something which I kind of want to test because it's necessary? Like, for instance, if you have something you want to add to the database, you don't want to start testing on the UI layer, because the data, like, you basically take your item in your application, send it through the API, which is somehow taken up by your backend, and then the backend does the magic. So you have like a lot of points of failure and you don't know where it happens. So the test can't be deterministic at all. So what I would rather suggest, and again, like in this talk from Richard Bradshaw, which the name I forgot, I can send it to you later, is basically like, think again of your application in kind of layers and think, what is the first point of isolation you can find those ones? And then have just a couple of tests testing the whole integration, but you don't have to test everything on the UI layer, because this is very an anti-pattern. Does this answer your question? Sorry, I got into a rant at this moment.
A bit, yeah. But basically, what I was trying to establish, like, whether you would use the same tool or various tools for each, like web, Android, and iOS, and which amount of shared code base would you have as a result of that?
Mm-hmm. It depends. Like, I had one project where I did everything on the same code base, which worked somehow by injecting the driver. But I had also projects, for instance, where the Android app and the iOS app differed so strongly that it was anyways kind of two different tests. The only thing which basically was kind of doubled was the test data generation, but everything test related itself needed to be different. So there is no answer which works, but I would try to, yeah, it depends on how much setup you have to do. But I would rather go with different setups or different test frameworks, because otherwise it can create headache and you have to build a lot around this. And I've seen this, and I was not, and I did this and I was not happy with it.
I see. Thank you very much. And have you had, well, obviously this bit that where you demonstrated here, this is all Selenium world and everything. Have you heard of non-Selenium based technologies such as Tescafe and Cypress, which, admittedly they work only for web, but
Yeah.
they function quite differently than Selenium. And if so, would you recommend like hybrid solutions, so say mobile apps via Appium, which is Selenium again, and web part on this like standalone technology? How do you see such hybrid work?
I would say it's something I did before. Like, this is actually not Selenium. This is Espresso, which is the native Android testing framework. It's not working like Selenium at all. And I did this actually also in my previous job, where I worked in one team. We decided for using, what was the name again? No, Puppeteer, sorry. So we were using Puppeteer basically for our web tests. I didn't have any mobile tests in there, but I do like those different approaches sometimes, and I don't like them. It's like, it depends on your team setup, it depends on your application. So I'm sorry, I can't give you like a answer, take this. And I don't want to, because there is no tool which does everything for you.
No, obviously not. And like, I'm not looking for an like answer, take this or take that. Like what I'm looking for is more like, what would you take as a factor to build your decision upon?
Um,
Besides
I would
like app complexity, like any technical recommendations that you might suggest?
So if everything is mixed up and you have like a lot of people having already Selenium knowledge in your, like, this is one of the things I would look at, like, what kind of knowledge is in my team already there? So if I have a team full of Selenium experts and Appium is very Selenium based, I would not go with a different solution, because, or I would not go is also the wrong word, but I would like, this would be like a very much a point pointing me towards Selenium. If there's something which I want to test on different devices, for instance, or different browser constellations, this is already a thing pointing towards Selenium in this case. But for instance, if I know it's like an internal software, it will always run on Chrome. I personally right now would always take a more easier, more development closer method, like Puppeteer, like Cypress, because they are faster, and Selenium can get very brittle. It's not Selenium itself, it's mostly the tests, but Selenium, you have to think a lot of weights, you have to have a lot of fluff around, you have to think about, whilst at Cypress or Puppeteer or Playwright or name it, they have a lot of functionality in there too. So, but they work only for certain platforms. Same for Appium. I worked with Appium a lot of times, and it can be a pain. Whilst Espresso is so much faster, so much like easier, and you can do a lot of things you can't do with Appium, because you're using different like you're using different internal APIs. So it can be an advantage, it can be a disadvantage. It also depends like how your team set up is. Have you an external testing team which is doing the testing afterwards, or is your tester embedded in the team, or maybe even you have a whole team approach where everyone is responsible for the test. So these are the things I would I would try to keep in mind and look at the whole constellation. What kind of tools are there? What advantages, disadvantages do they bring? And they bring like everyone, like again, like every tool has a lot of advantages and some disadvantages, and you have to think for yourself, what is important for me and for us as a team. So is it speed? It's Puppeteer at Cypress. If it's you have like really unexperienced testers, I would maybe rather go with the also with this way, but it depends. So sorry, I hope this kind of answers your question.
There are definitely some wonderful insights. Thank you very much.
Anything else?
Do you have any experience with code-free tools? For example, Tosca's being pushed.
It's really hard to understand you, but what I got was, if I have experience with code-free tools, I had it like 5 or 10 years ago, and at this point they were not very good. They were like these recording tools, and they were not that good. I think nowadays there are better solutions. There are even AI-based solutions, but I never tried them. I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Now, if you're looking for a code-free tool, try Tescafe Studio. This is paid product of DevExpress. So the free thing called Tescafe, per se, it's an engine, it's free. But the studio actually has like a powerful constructor where you can create code without coding actually. Like if you're looking for codeless tools, that is something that definitely worth looking into.
Thanks a lot.
DevExpress definitely should pay me for advertising, really.
Are there more
And
questions?
I have a question. I'm sorry. So for example, for a team that is starting in automation, where would you recommend to start, like to define a framework? Do you recommend, I don't know, articles, or do you recommend any specific framework, or is it something that has really to be defined case by case inside of the company?
I would say like there are tools which are easier, not easy, but I think it depends on, like, a lot on your context. So again, like if it's a team, if it's embedded into your team and you have a certain, like you have, for instance, what I always do is I try to use the language, I try to consolidate languages. So if the developer is writing in Java, I try to use a Java tool. If they write in JavaScript, same here. This is what be one approach, like looking for tools which use the same language. This can, for instance, increase or decrease the number of frameworks you have. Like JavaScript, you have like a whole bunch of things. Or you think of what kind of knowledge do we have in our company and do we have in our teams. One thing I would really stress on this one, if you start writing test automation, get the developers actually on board, like let everyone have kind of stakes in there, because then you have like a knowledge share and different articles and tools. It's really, again, like I'm using a lot. There is like a very good website which is called the Test Automation University, which is actually from Apple Tools and which is promoted by, oh, what was her name again? I'm so bad with names. Angie Jones. And Angie Jones is really, really good. So she is promoting this one, and there are a lot of very good tutorials in literally every tool I know and I've seen, and it's growing, and you can kind of collect credits there, and it can help you getting an insight and into different topics, like where you should start, and it depends on your software actually. So I mean, it also depends like how you can test things, how testable is your application. For instance, what I said before, I try always to test on lower levels first. So I try to enforce people writing unit tests, and you enforce people writing those API tests, because they can catch a lot of things a lot quicker. So these are two things I can really recommend. Another thing would be a lot of talks, again, by Richard Bradshaw and Mark Winteringham. They are more about how to reduce your test framework, how to make it more stable. What else? Not sure. There is someone writing something. Sorry.
Yes, someone sent, Valerie sent a link.
Thank you, Valerie. And these are the things I would do. Like, again, like where to start, how to start is really hard to say. I'm sorry on this one. Did this answer your question, or did I create more question marks for you?
I think it's okay. Thank you so much. Yes, I think you did.
No worries. There's another message in the chat. Corinna, can you?
Yes, I can read out. So what is your take on test-driven development? How would this approach change the way we can develop our test framework?
That's a very good question. I do like TDD a lot, but like in the pure form, it's more a development and more and more kind of a design tool, because you write your tests, your classes in a better way. Writing UI tests and API tests before is sometimes very hard and can lead you into like, oh yeah, we're writing this now, and okay, we don't have the selectors we need, and it can be very tedious. And I've encountered this a couple of times already. Sometimes not. For development purposes, I do like it a lot, but for testing, it's like I haven't seen it working so far. But which doesn't mean it's impossible. But yeah, I tried it once, didn't work for me. But again, I'm sorry, I don't have too much really good examples on this one. I think I'd stop sharing. It's easier, I guess.
Okay, there's another one. What about BDD?
BDD, I do like it, but BDD, if you mean now Cucumber or BDD has like two different meanings often. A lot of people, when they talk about DDD, they mean tools, and BDD is not a tool-based approach. BDD is in general is a very communicative approach. So I worked in a couple of teams which did BDD in the way how it is supposed to be, which means basically you have like the three amigo principle, and you have the specs written by your business analyst or whoever takes this role. And in this case, it's a great principle when everyone is on board. But if you just use Cucumber or any kind of other BDD tools, it creates like a layer you actually don't need, because what I always do if I think about BDD, or if I think, do I want to use Cucumber or not, is asking myself, who is the person reading it at the end? And if it's you as tester, it doesn't help you too much. But if it's, for instance, your business analyst is very, very interested, or your requirement engineer or your stakeholders are very interested in getting those test results, and they are actively reading it, it's like a very, very good tool of communicating your work as tester or as a team, because this is something a lot of teams are very bad at showing, like, what can we do and what are we good at. And therefore, it's a great tool if you use it in a communication. If you just use it for the sake of, yeah, we use now BDD, I would really discourage you.
Hi. I have usually worked with Selenium and TestNG, but I would like to find out more about other testing tools, automation
Mhm.
test tools. So from where can I find out about these tools, what is new in market, and,
Mm.
probably take a trial run of these tools.
Thank you. So one of the things I was talking before was like the Test Automation University, which is really good for starting things. There is the Ministry of Testing, which is actually a UK-based no, it's not really organization, but they are like a bunch of testers, and they have like the club, which is a forum where they are very friendly. There's a tester Slack from Ministry of Testing where you can ask a lot of questions, and where the people are really, really into testing and sharing their knowledge. You have a lot of people I was like naming today are in this channel, like um, Richard Bradshaw is actually founder or the big boss, how he's calling himself. And there are a lot of people. They also do online conferences, which are, I think the next one is the test.bash, which is somewhere end of this month, and it costs £79, and it's like a 24-hour online conference all about test automation. And the people who are going there are often very enthusiastic about it. So these are the two things I'm basically using, looking into new trends. I think there are more, but these are the things I'm mostly using.
Okay, thank you.
What is the name of the conference again? Maybe you can also write it, Sven.
I'm writing it down. So it's the Test Bash is the name. I think this one is actually called, and because it's a more tech-related conference, the Test Bash usually has like testing topics, but also on a more broader scale. And the Test.bash is more. Thank you, Paul, for sharing. Even better.
Okay, we're actually quite okay with time. So maybe if somebody has another question. Okay, we have one more. I'm going to read it out loud. A bit of a beginner question. Where do you prefer to store test files in your code base? Any differences between your personal projects and projects shared with a team?
I think, or I'm muted. No, I'm not. Okay. I think, again, it depends. Like my personal preference is always to have the test files with the code base itself, because this means like the deployed application and your test files are on the same state. If you have them in a different repository or lying in a different space, you have always to think about versioning. For instance, your test files are now valid for version 1.0, and there was a release which changes things. So you have like your application is 1.1, and then you have to kind of match those versions together. You either have a program, or what we did in the company was basically creating another repository, which was basically like just a text file saying like which version of test or which commit of test is fitting to which version of your application. So this can create a lot of problems, especially where if you have rerolls and things you have to roll back, and this can get a little bit problematic if you have them in a different space. But for instance, if you think about API tests which use different systems and do need to use different systems, it's sometimes better to have them separated. So it always depends on how your setup is, and But in general, I would always prefer having them at the code base if it's somehow possible.
Okay, I can also read the next one. How do you tackle scaling, creating our own grid using a third-party service? And for mobile, having on-premise real devices while working from home is suboptimal. So should we use emulator simulators or test in the cloud? Any experience there?
So I have a bit of experience on this behalf. In my previous company, we were actually using Browser Stack for mobile application. It is super expensive. So this is something you have to keep in mind. But they take care of everything. And this is like usually quite optimal. The problem with emulators and simulators, even though they get better every time, they are still simulators and emulators. So they are not like a real device and you don't know how the interaction is. So for pure functional testing, simulators are okay, but the moment when you really want to have some tactile testing or you really want to experience applications in this behalf, it's always better having a device. But this depends on the size of your project, the size of your company, actually how much money you're willing to spend, because every kind of external solution costs money, and unfortunately too much money in my I would say. But on the other hand, they do take care of everything. Like if you have a grid on your own, you have to maintain it, and this is something you have to keep in mind too. 1 second, sorry. Sorry, I needed to. So just keep this in mind. Like it's expensive, but they do everything for you, or you have it on premise. What I do usually for Chrome, like what I did in my previous job also for Chrome testing, was basically using a Docker image with Chrome on it and using Puppeteer on a headless browser. If you're happy with this one, and if you know you don't have a lot of JavaScript which is running there, you can do this. But if you have like a very JavaScript heavy page, I would rather recommend not doing it. So I have experience with both, but there is no clear way where I can say like you should do it this way. It again like depends how much you want to spend.
Okay. One final question before we wrap up. It's very
If there's none, I
quiet.
would say thank you very much for your attendance and thank you very much for all the questions. I really appreciated them, and I really appreciate that you're so enthusiastic about it.
A big thank you from my side as well, everyone, for joining us this evening. I will stop the recording now.